looked around, there was nobody there, but it was so terrifying that John just abandoned the search for gold and just hopped back on his horse and fled out of there. But within a couple of days, John and the priest had convinced themselves that those weird noises and that laughter that John had heard out there was just some bird, that it was all in John's head. He was spooked for no reason. But in reality, it was just that incredible pull of that gold being out there waiting to be claimed. It was like John and the priest, they couldn't not go looking for it. And so John decided to go back out into the woods. Except this time, he did not go alone. He brought a group of men with him. And so this group, led by John, retraced Frank and Blackjack's steps down that skinny trail all the way to their campsite. And when they got there, John just froze. He could not believe what he was seeing. The rocks that were sitting on the grave where John had just buried Blackjack were gone. These huge rocks just missing. And also, the tent, the bloodied tent where Blackjack had been murdered, had also been cleared. There was no trace of it anywhere. It was like the campsite had never existed. And this made no sense to John, because he knows this is a totally isolated part of the wilderness. Like, nobody comes through here. Who in their right mind would just happen to pass by and randomly grab all these rocks and a tent covered in blood and take it out of here? It made no sense. Like, who could have done this? Now, until this point, John really had convinced himself that everything he'd experienced the time before was in his head. It was just a bird, or, it was just normal forest sounds. And he also, like the priest, had convinced himself that Frank's original story about Blackjack's ghost chasing him out of the forest was just the ramblings of a crazy, guilty man. A murderer's guilty conscience had created that story. But now, as John was surveying the scene in front of him, he couldn't help but think, maybe this place is haunted. And so once again, John just turned and fled. He and the men, they got out of there as fast as they could. And when John got back to town, instead of going to the priest, he just went right to the bar and just started drinking. And he kept on drinking until he died of alcohol poisoning just a couple of days later. And John's death started a chain of unexplained catastrophes, all connected to this gold. First, the priest, after discovering what happened to John, didn't really spend any time grieving the loss of his friend. Instead, the priest just saddled up and headed out into the woods to find the gold himself. However, he found the trail that led out to the campsite and to the gold had been destroyed in a forest fire. Then, Lafayette French, the rich investor who had bankrolled the original expedition, he heard about the mine and decided he would go find it. However, the guide that he hired to take him there literally died on the way into the forest. By this point, French had heard all the stories about how, Blackjack's ghost was out in this forest haunting the area, preventing people from finding the gold. But French ignored all those stories. Just like with Frank and the priest and John, it was like that gold had an unbreakable hold on him. And so for 30 years, French kept going out into that forest, searching for that gold mine, and eventually he found it. Or at least that's what he said in the last letter he wrote back home. But we'll never actually know for sure, because after sending that letter, on that same day, Lafayette's cabin burned down and he died without telling anybody the location of the mine. And so with French's death, that sort of solidified the rumors that the haunting was real. And people began to believe that there was only one thing that could explain this almost magnetic pull the gold had on so many people, and also all the terrible fates that befell everybody who tried to go look for it. And that was that the gold mine was cursed. And today, people still believe that Blackjack's ghost is out there in the forest, preventing people from finding the gold. But whatever the truth is, whether the curse is real or not, to this day, no one has ever been able to successfully find the gold again and live to tell about it.
Usain Bolt.
Are you the type of person who has binged basically all of my YouTube videos? Every week, you anxiously waited to upload? If so, thank you, but also you're in luck. Because if you didn't know this, we actually have a separate podcast, the Mr. Ballin Podcast, that has literally hundreds of stories that are not on YouTube that you can binge right now. That podcast is available on all podcast platforms. Again, it's just called the Mr. Ballin Podcast. And on Mondays on that podcast, we upload exclusive new content that is not on YouTube to the podcast. That's Mondays. And then on Thursday, we remaster the audio of your favorite videos on YouTube and put those on the podcast. But again, Mondays, those are brand new and exclusive to the podcast. But if you want to hear those exclusive episodes 1 month ahead of today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please steal the like button's mail and take all the money their grandmother sent them for their birthday. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories.
Can't reach here. Yeah, it's my friend. She's getting married.
On August 14th, 2005.
My friend is getting married.
2 Greek military fighter pilots flew in their jets high above Athens, Greece, following behind a Boeing 737 commercial airplane. This commercial airplane was Helios Airways Flight 522. It had left Cyprus at 9 a.m. that morning with 121 people on board, and it was scheduled to have landed in Athens 45 minutes earlier. But instead, shortly after takeoff, Flight 522's pilots had stopped responding to air traffic control, and now the plane was just circling right over the city. And so at some point, the military became concerned that perhaps Flight 522 had been hijacked, and at some point, the hijackers were going to crash the plane into a city. And so in response to that, they had sent up these 2 fighter pilots to see what was going on. Now, when the 2 fighter pilots arrived on station in the air, right behind Flight 522, at first, they couldn't tell what the issue was. There was no fire or visible smoke or any damage to the aircraft. And so the 2 fighter pilots in tandem flew up alongside the plane so they could look inside the windows. And when they did, and they saw inside to the actual fuselage, they saw all the oxygen masks were dropped down in front of the passengers, and all the passengers had the masks on. However, all the passengers were passed out. They were slumped over with these masks strapped to their faces. Now, the fighter pilots had no idea if these passengers were unconscious, or dead, or some combination. But for right now, all they cared about was, are the pilots conscious and able to fly this craft? And so the 2 fighter pilots flew up until they were parallel with the cockpit, and they looked in the window, and they saw not the pilots. They saw the oxygen mask drop down, but the pilots were not there. Instead, they saw this one guy who was clearly not a pilot. He was not in a pilot's uniform, looking out the window at them, just waving, just some random guy. And so the 2 fighter pilots had no idea what to make of this. Before the fighter pilots could even begin to react to whatever was going on here, this random guy in the cockpit looked out at one of the fighter pilots and just began gesturing down with his index finger. And then a moment later, Flight 522 began to descend. To fully understand what happens next, we need to go back to just before 9 a.m. on the same morning. So 9 a.m. was takeoff, and right before, the crew of Flight 522 did their routine safety checks of the aircraft, and they determined that the craft was ready for takeoff. However, they had actually missed one crucial thing. There was a knob on this aircraft that was switched to the wrong setting by a maintenance person right before takeoff, and nobody had noticed, so it wasn't put back to where it needed to be. And so Flight 522 wound up taking off on schedule, and at first, everything was fine, totally normal. But about 2 minutes into the flight, all these alarms began sounding on the aircraft, and then the oxygen mask dropped from the ceiling. And the reason for that is that knob that had been set to the wrong setting controlled how much breathable air was in the aircraft during flight. It basically had been switched to off. So there was nothing to breathe in the airplane. And so by the time these masks were dropping down, people on the plane were already passing out, including the pilots. They were passed out pretty much immediately when those masks came down. And so it's absolutely chaos in this plane. Everybody's passing out, except for one person, 25-year-old flight attendant Andreas Prodromou, who, when the masks came down, he was awake, he was conscious, and instead of grabbing one of those masks from the overhead, he managed to connect himself to one of the emergency oxygen tanks. Now, the reason that's very important is the masks that drop down on an aircraft have a very limited supply of oxygen. But Andreas, who was actually training to be a pilot, was aware of that, and he put on this emergency oxygen tank, which had way more oxygen to it.
Wow.
And so suddenly he's breathing a much longer air source, and he's looking around the plane, and everybody's passed out except for him. Now, we don't know at what point he learned this, but at some point, Andreas would have noticed, as he's breathing on this emergency oxygen tank, that out the window he can see the plane is just flying in circles. And it would have dawned on him that not only are the passengers out, but very likely so are the pilots. And so literally there's nobody flying this plane. And so he had a decision to make. Either he was going to just sit here until the plane crashed, or he was going to do something, like try to fly the plane. And that's what he ultimately decided to do. And so Andreas stood up, he took his oxygen tank, and he headed into the cockpit. And after moving aside the unconscious pilots, he attempted to fly this plane. And so the two fighter pilots who
I am
flew alongside the
challenging
cockpit
myself for
looked in
30
and saw that
days
one random guy who was waving to
to
them.
go live.
That was Andreas. And unfortunately, despite the fact that Andreas
30
was
days
training to
straight.
become a pilot, he was not remotely qualified or skilled enough to fly a big Boeing 737. He had no idea how to fly this aircraft. And making the situation even worse is very shortly after Andreas entered the cockpit, the plane ran out of fuel. And so it left its automatic holding pattern that it had been in, flying in circles, and just automatically began trying to descend. But that required pilot input to land the plane. But Andreas knew he couldn't possibly land this plane successfully. And so as the plane automatically began its descent down towards Athens, this huge city full of people, Andreas did the one thing he could do. He took one last look at one of the fighter pilots outside the window, and he gestured to them that the plane was now beginning to descend. And then Andreas, he grabbed the yoke of the aircraft and he intentionally banked it to the left, basically flying the plane away from Athens. And he guided this plane into an unpopulated hillside where it crashed. Andreas and all 120 people on that plane all died in the crash. However,
Wow.
because of Andreas's heroic final act of steering the plane away from Athens, not a single person on the ground was hurt.
Wow.
Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. So it's the new year, which means a lot of us, me included, have made New Year's resolutions. And while resolutions are generally a good thing, making some sort of change in your life, they also introduce a lot of stress and anxiety because I included often struggle to actually accomplish my New Year's resolution. And in years past, when I didn't hit the mark I wanted to hit, I just started feeling really bad
Okay,
about
let me
myself, like
see.
I'm a failure
I gotta
for not
remember.
doing
Hi,
this thing, this
Ava.
big change I wanted to make.
I gotta remember how to cut this top out. For the stress. How are you, Ava? I hope you're having a good day so far. I am early online today. Okay, so it's not going that low. It's gonna gather at the shoulder. Okay. 30 days live streaming straight. We're gonna try that because I'm trying to get monetized this year for sure. Monetize this channel. And with y'all's help, I can do that, right? Okay, so the width and length. Right. I might have to wash wash this fabric? Like, I'm thinking I might have to wash this. I should have washed it before I cut it out. Yeah, I'm gonna wash it. So unfortunately sometimes fabric just needs to wash. So I'm gonna wash them. Already did the bottom over there, so I'm not gonna mess with that. But these gotta wash. Alright y'all, I'll be back once it's washed up. I'll be back. See you guys soon.